So welcome everybody to the monthly Saturday morning class. Particularly like the aspect that I'm talking about today. So the system of practice has 5 aspects. The first is around integration, we call it, and if you were here in January, Ratnaprabha would have introduced that. The second we term positive emotion. It's often linked to the Metta Bhavana meditation, if you've done that one. And there was a talk on that last month. And this one has the not always very inviting title of spiritual death. And then the other two, which will come up next month and the one after, are spiritual rebirth and receptivity. And one of the ways I tend to sort of see it in terms of this particular aspect of the system of practice is that practicing the integration is gives us access to a sense of calm and perspective and basically just a better way to be. And it also is an essential foundation. And the positive emotion, gives what it says on the tin, more sort of positive emotional states and way to work with that. But this aspect, the sort of spiritual death aspect, the insight aspect, is the game changer. It's the thing really that makes Buddhism different from, say, practicing mindfulness in order to have, a calmer life or a more spacious life. It's the bit that's about waking up to reality. It's about freedom. And I'm going to unpack that a bit in terms of what that means. But very much, this is why also why I really like the system of practice. In order to practice within this aspect, the insight aspect, spiritual death aspect, you need the grounding of integration. You need the positive emotion. You need the inspiration that comes with the spiritual rebirth aspect and also receptivity. So it's part of a whole, and that's incredibly important. But within this aspect, there are different ways into it, different things that people find really helpful in terms of the insight aspect. But this talk is called Opening to Vision, the Path of Directly Seeing Reality. And that's because this particular way in terms of looking at what does that mean, directly seeing, and how does one practice it, has been the way in that's been most helpful for me, and that I feel is quite accessible. I feel quite motivated to try and communicate it, which is why I'm sitting here. So, opening to vision, the path of directly seeing reality. Unfortunately, we can't just do it as an act of will. I can't say, hey, look, it's just over there. Though in some ways it is. We hear in some of the tales of the Buddha's time when he was teaching, there were times where he would just hold up a flower or say a few words and people sort of just got it. They saw it there and then, but I don't know how to do that. And in a way I say sort of, unfortunately, we can't just say it's over there. Oh yeah, I see it. I get it. Because if we did, and not just intellectually or conceptually, but in a way that really, a way that's sort of experiential, that actually it would transform how we responded to everything, to the world, to each other, to ourselves. And it would transform it in terms of freeing us from what we term dukkha. It's the term dukkha in Buddhism, a term you may well have come across. Dukkha gets translated sometimes as suffering, but it's maybe more accurately translated as sort of unsatisfactoriness, sort of like, oh, it's not quite as we want it. There's one of the images used a lot in Buddhism is of an ill-fitting cartwheel. Obviously, this is from some time ago, but you can imagine being in a cart and one of the wheels doesn't quite fit. So there's just a sense it's a bit clunky, it doesn't quite fit, which can often be our sense of in life, either that we are actively aware of pain or suffering or things not being as we would like them to be, or just that there's a more lurking sense of unsatisfactoriness, not quite as we'd like it, or it doesn't quite fit sort of feeling. And also, this sense of directly seeing reality would also help overcome often what can be quite an innate sense of separation, our own separation from, or maybe even from ourselves, but also from each other, from the world, leading to a sort of a deep sense of connection, of lack of separation. Though it is also important to say this sense, looking at this insight dimension and the directly seeing reality, we're not looking at, feeling blissed out constantly, or a real sort of state change in that sense. Even when you see that clearly, although there is a freedom and a holding lightly within things, there is also still a whole range of emotions, and life happens. Obviously, things go wrong, people we love suffer, etc. So we can't just do it, but we can set up the conditions for that seeing to arise. And actually, it's also important to say that it's not, we don't see it in a way, it is revealed. It's something that just is revealed. And we can, consciously set up the conditions to make that more possible. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to do that I got 6 different headings. What is it that we're trying to see? Why bother? And then looking at the whole aspect of direct experience when we look at direct seeing. And then around, investigation, inquiry, so that developing that skill. Recognition, so recognizing when it is seen, it is revealed. And then what? So I'm going to say a bit about each of those. So what is it that we're talking about when you talk about seeing reality from a Buddhist perspective? Obviously this is a really, Saturday mornings are a mixed, open to all level classes, so some of you may be very familiar with those teachings and some not. But at its sort of basis, reality, the nature of reality from a Buddhist perspective is that things, experience, everything is not as fixed or solid as we perceive it to be. So that can be our natural perception. Rather, there's a sort of what's happening moment by moment is a flow of arisings, passings, just things happening and influencing each other, arising on the basis of each other. But within that, so there's lots happening, there's lots of experience, but the nature of it is not solid, it's not graspable. We can't hold on to things, we can't grasp that. And and that might be people, it might be things, it might be whatever. We can't hold on to things. And it is that assuming it has a solid nature that we can grasp hold of and keep, if we just tried harder or just did it better, that gives rise to this sense of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, the dukkha. And also within that, there is a basic assumption that we grow up with. I don't know that we're born with it, but as human beings, that we grow up with, that also perceives ourselves as solid. There's something really sort of solid about ourselves, something that, and therefore that leads to a sense of separation. It's something that we need to protect or shore up in some way, often by acquiring things, which may be people and love and admiration, or they may be material things. But it gives rise, that sense of us as a solid, existing, separate reality is also the foundation of a lot of this sort of unsatisfactoriness or suffering we feel in life, because it makes us separate. We feel, I'm over here, you're over there, we might be competing for resources, or we might be, doing all sorts of things that puts us in opposition with each other, or I want you to shore me up in that way, or whatever. So it gives us a certain relationship to everything around us. And because of that, it's very natural as human beings to have a sense that things are not quite right. And that could be quite mild, this sort of sense of existential, what's going on here? Or it can be quite acute, and that might, will vary at different times in life. Obviously, there are huge amounts of books over centuries written about the nature of reality from a Buddhist perspective. So I'm merely sort of touching into it to say this is what we're talking about. This is the nature of looking at this third aspect of the system of practice, the spiritual death aspect. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is, I've termed it why bother, but I was thinking about, so why would you? Why do you want to perceive this directly? Why would you want to do this investigation or look at it? And I came up with, there was three things I was thinking about within that is sort of motivation, confidence, and curiosity. So motivation might be from past experience. You've been out in nature at some point, and it's just like suddenly there's been a bit of a paradigm shift in how you've perceived this. There's been a sense maybe of more expansiveness of the things you were worrying about dropping away. You may well have those sort of direct experiences already, and you want to find a way back to them, or you want that to be more of your experience of life. Or, people where you think they've got something, they're lighter, they're this, they're that, what is it about them? Or you've read something in books, seen things watched things online where people are talking about this, the sort of, about waking up. So that would be a sort of, motivation, and it maybe just motivation as in, this isn't working for me right now. Things don't feel okay. What can I do about it? Another aspect of what might make you bother would be confidence. And I think confidence is incredibly important in the spiritual life. And in this context, it would be confidence of knowing that it is possible to do this. We're looking at that actually, although these teachings, when you try and engage with them conceptually, they can feel a bit like, oh, hang on, what's that meant? And the way they're the way they're expressed conceptually, and mostly we express things conceptually because we use words, I'm using them now, but there's a lot of sort of paradox, for example. There's a lot of, it's not this, it's not that, it's not that, there's lots of different ways where you can read about it, and it all sounds a bit like, oh, don't get it. And so therefore it can feel like it's quite remote. It's just for, really advanced practitioners that have been practicing for decades or whatever. So I think it's important also just to be able to touch into confidence that it is possible to do this. It is for everybody, to see directly. I mean, there is, likely to be an unfolding over time that's a very long time, but in terms of seeing this, it is possible. And as I say, you may well have those experiences already. That might be why you're here. And so their third aspect of the why bother would just be curiosity. In fact, I think it was curiosity. Well, that was my main experience when I first came into a Buddhist centre to learn to meditate. My sort of top line experience of why I was bothering to do that was curiosity. It's just like, there's got to be more to being human than what I'm experiencing at the moment. This was when I was in my 20s, so a while ago. But anyway. Yes, so those are the first two things. It's like, roughly what are we looking at and why would we bother to look at it? And then the third thing of this six that I was, just in terms of how I've portioned up the talk, is to do with paying attention to what we directly experience moment by moment in the present moment. And in fact, I was talking to somebody yesterday here who's been around for ages, and she was sort of saying, so why do we always talk about tuning into physical sensations in the body or tuning into sounds? You know, why do we keep doing that? And she'd asked someone who'd said, yeah, good question. I'm not quite sure. We do that a lot. Yeah. And we do it a lot. But the answer is really that there can be two different reasons why we might do that. So, you know, when you come along to meditate, you know, at any level, you will get that, you know, tune in to what you can actually feel in the body, the sensations of the breath. You know, it can be really helpful to open to sounds, to just be aware of the sounds arising and passing. And one of the reasons it's important to do that is simply because it can really help calm our experience. You know, what we're doing when we're meditating is trying to come out of our heads, out of that, come into our bodies. And so that thing of, you know, tuning into the sensations in your body, you know, and you know, you can do it with sound, sights, anything, is a way to do that. So that's the integration aspect of the system of practice. It's really foundational. It's absolutely essential. And in terms of what I'm talking about here, it's really important to be able to pay attention to our direct experience and identify it from an insight perspective. So in other words, you've got the sort of, you might hear the words shamatha and vipassana, the sort of calming and insight aspects. And what I'm talking about here is more from that insight aspect. And being able to pay attention to what is arising moment by moment, what's actually happening, is a really essential foundation for what I'm talking about in terms of that path of directly seeing reality. It's about knowing, you know, what is real. And just to explain that, everything that we experience directly in the moment is arising through one of the six senses. So we're all familiar probably with the five main senses. So it's either sort of touch, you know, physical sensations in the body, or sight, or sound, taste and smell. So those are the five main senses that we're very aware of. So everything that you're directly experiencing here and now is in one of those. You've got a distant drill and my voice and any other sounds around, and you know, the sight of each other or whatever. But from a sort of Buddhist understanding and other understandings as well, you also talk about thought. So what's the activity in the mind is also a sense, or the mind heart is also a sense. And so in any given moment, if you want to know what's actually happening, what your direct experience is in the moment, you're tuning in to one or more of those senses, including aware of what's happening in the mind. That's all fine. And actually, you know, I just wanted to say something about thoughts, because thoughts are really, really helpful when we want them. You know, we do a lot of working stuff out, and, you know, you may have jobs where you need to use thought, and, you know, we have thought to communicate, language, you know, it's not the enemy. We try not to focus on it too much in meditation, but it's great in its place. But what can happen just by the nature of who we are as human beings, and is that we can end up mistaking thought for direct reality, and we get sort of lost in a world of thought. And so that's what we're inhabiting all of the time, is the world of thought. So anytime your attention is in the past or the future, that's because you're just in the world of thought rather than directly experiencing. And most of the time, if you sort of look at it, you'll find that probably a lot of your time you are either in the past or the future rather than now. And So it's really important to just practice that, to practice, okay, what's actually happening now, and being able to tune into experience through all the senses. And one of the reasons why we do talk a lot about sound is it is often one of the most the easiest ones to do that with, to tune into sounds arising and passing. And then on the basis of doing that sort of being able to just tune in, you know, whether it's to sort of sensations in the toes and things, body, is the fourth aspect I wanted to talk about, which is around inquiry, investigation, looking, really, actively looking. So, you know, based on that ability to be able to direct attention to what's happening here and now through the six senses, we can then be sort of curious and investigate what's actually happening, sort of inquire into the nature of what we are experiencing. And we can do that consciously. For example, we can try and investigate or be curious about something that feels solid. Or we can be curious about the nature of a thought, for example. You know, what's actually happening. If you look at the nature of a thought, I mean, thoughts are either images or words, you know, and you could look, like if you decide to think about a big plump strawberry, you'll probably find that's an image in your mind. I mean, our minds vary in these ways, but a lot of the time thought is happening as words as well. Or, you know, if you have a memory of a lovely sunset, that'll probably come up as an image, for example. But we can also investigate or inquire into, when you can sort of directly tune into your experience in the moment, you could then sort of drop questions in, for example, about, the sense of self, the sense of who you are, and just notice, is that always the same, for example? So one of the things that's quite accessible to investigate, for example, you know, because sometimes we have a really solid sense of self. And generally, if we're feeling upset or threatened or cross, we have a really solid sense of self. But it's quite interesting to notice that. And then maybe at other moments where you've got a bit of space, maybe you're out in the beautiful nature or countryside, you're looking up at the sky, having a nice conversation with somebody, or you're on your own, and you might then investigate, so what's the nature of self now? What does that feel like? And it might be that you can't really find anything much, you know, or it's very light, or it's very open, it's just very... And that's a really interesting, because, you know, there may be a really basic assumption going on sort of experientially that, you know, this is me. And actually, if you investigate, if you look, you know, that experience of what is me is very changeable. It's very ungraspable. It's like everything that Buddhism is pointing to, this flow of arisings. You know, this happens, a sense of self is like that. You know, conditions are like this. The sense of self is very diffuse or really hard to identify. Don't worry if this doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but it's quite interesting just to look at it. You know, we can also look at, I mean, you know, other things like, for example, the weather. The weather's quite good. The weather keeps changing. You can look at that, you know, what is weather, for example, and also emotional weather. You know, sometimes we think, you know, well, that we're a certain way, or this is happening. And actually, if you look at your emotions, it's a constantly changing flow. You know, even sometimes when it feels really solid, especially if you decide to investigate it. You know, for example, I've had experiences where, I mean, one of the range of emotions I've had to work with most really is irritation, anger, you know, and I might be like really, really cross and then, you know, and sit and I think, okay, but actually something catches that and thinks, okay, I actually don't want to exist with this state at the moment. And so I've, had experiences of feeling that and deciding to sit with it or even sit to meditate. And then just investigating directly in reality what's actually happening. There's this really big, tight, hot feeling sort of in somewhere in the center of the chest, and there's these thoughts going, and it's just like, oh, that's interesting, that's a big reaction or whatever. But, to be able to really sort of sit back and look at directly what's happening. And then invariably, really, in my experience, what then happens is that, I don't know, I'll suddenly find I'm thinking about what to have for lunch or something. It's like something that felt really solid and enduring and like, how will this ever change, has just suddenly completely dissipated and evaporated. So it's really helpful just to look at these things and just how much our experience, our sense of self changes, emotions change, thoughts change. But when you're looking at what this is pointing to is looking at all that changing, ungraspable nature of your own direct experience from the perspective of saying, this is what Buddhism's pointing to, folks. There may be a basic assumption that underneath that, all of that, there's still a solid me doing all of this and directing it. Somehow there's a controller in my head going, yeah, do that, but actually, can we find it? Where is it? Is there anything other than this changing flow of emotional weather? Anyway, I could talk about it for hours, but I won't. So the fifth aspect of these 6 things that I wanted to talk about is to do with recognizing. As this sort of path of directly seeing reality is not about intellectually understanding the teachings of Buddhism. We know this sort of thing. It's about directly seeing that reality in a way that really changes our experience momentarily or ongoingly. And so whether consciously through inquiring or not, just based on, I don't know, having a bit more space, tuning in, whatever it is, it's good to recognize when that reality is directly seen. And you recognize it, and as I say, you've probably had these experiences anyway, where there's a sort of a moment of release, a moment of lightness, so like, oh, there's a sort of aha moment, or just a bit more lightness, a bit more. You might even laugh because something that felt really important and solid is seen to be slightly ridiculous. It can manifest in all sorts of ways, but the Buddha talked about, a taste of freedom. There is there's something that feels like it's a release. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell a story from my life from a long time ago, and I'm hoping that people haven't heard it before. Has anybody heard me talk about head lice in the context of the Dharma before? Good, that's nice. Okay, hopefully everyone knows what head lice are. Kids get them a lot. Yeah, I have kids. I did. They're grown up now. But so this was a moment a long time ago, like going back nearly 20 years. But it was a really defining moment for me in terms of this sort of seeing. And so you have to sort of picture the scene. I'm in the kitchen, just put the kids to bed, and I'm waiting for the kettle to boil. And my experience was that I felt completely exhausted. Life's quite tiring anyway as a sort of, working parent and all of that. But I just spent the evening delousing my children again. So it's anyway. So I was standing there just feeling completely exhausted, and there was this sense of a never-ending cycle. Just as I'm about to break the breeding cycle of the common head louse, they go to school and just lean their head against someone else's, or they go to their dad's and they have a comb-free weekend, and they come back. And so whenever I've told this story, it's like that story of the Greek god that pushes a boulder uphill, and then when he gets to the top, it rolls back down again. And it's really interesting because I always forget the name of that particular Greek god. Yeah, and every time I tell this story, somebody in the room knows what it is. Usually loads of people, and I still forget it again. Anyway, so it's like that, So my experience was of this very solid, never-ending reality of, head loss and exhaustion. But it was, what happened then was that by the kettle, because I wanted to be reminded of a different way of being, I was already, been practicing for years by then. I had these photos up by the kettle that I'd taken in the woods, in Queenswood, in fact, that were reminding me of, it was really the spiritual rebirth, the next aspect that we're talking about next month, which is what gives us inspiration. So these photos were moments where I had felt some freedom, some relief. I was in the woods and things. And so waiting for the kettle to boil, I noticed these, and they were there especially so I didn't wait for the kettle to boil and just eat lots of things. I was just like looking. So I noticed these and had this sense of, rather than this never ending reality, suddenly it was like, oh, but it has changed. They used to have frizzy blonde hair and now they've got, quite straight, thick brown hair. And, my daughter combs half her hair whilst I comb the other, for example. That was at that time. And there was also just this sense of connection through time with my mum, and she used to comb out lice out of our hair, and she would say, oh, lice only like really nice, clean hair. So she was sort of destigmatizing. So it wasn't like making it all worse by having, oh, they go. So, and I would do that with my children. I was always say, oh, yes, very nice, clean hair. That's why they like it. And, so I was non-stigmatizing about the lice. So there was that connection through time and space with my mother and with millions of parents all over who were combing lice and had been for decades and things. But the main thing, so suddenly everything has completely opened up, and it's experienced like this sort of drop of like, wow, I'm in a completely different reality, one that's light, connected, free, with everything. And I was laughing, it's just like, but so this is what, that would be an example of what we're talking about. Directly seeing the reality is that it's going from being stuck in this real solidity to something which could be a conscious practice of deciding to drop in and look, is it really that solid? I wasn't doing it consciously at that time. I was just looking at, but I did look up at something that reminded me there was another perspective. And through that, it just, that sort of dropped, So as I say, you've probably had experiences like that, and there've been others. They can happen, but it's was just one that I wanted to draw out to do that sort of sense of, it's by trying to be aware of what's going on in some way and really see that there is this bigger, more connected, freer perspective of everything changing and flowing. So the sixth one and the final one is around so that sense of you need to recognize it happening, and as I say, it is recognizable. So that's but then after that, in a way, all there is to do is just relax, enjoy it, and also know that you can't hold on to it and you can't go back to it, not that way. But and having had that experience in that moment, although, as I say, it's ungraspable, it's impermanent, just like everything else, that can help to then build all of these 6 aspects, because you've seen that, you're like, oh, so that's what the Buddha's talking about, or that's what Buddhism is talking about. I get it, in that moment, you get it, and so you have more understanding, and that might also give you more motivation, because it's like, hey, that's a better way to be. Let's have, want to do more of that, or find out how to get, sort of build that understanding. So it can build the motivation. And then, as I say, then you've got that aspect of, well, in the moment, and you might be triggered into awareness by something that's painful and solid, as I was in that moment. But that sort of looking at your direct experience, inquiring into it, what's actually happening, and then recognizing it. So it's having these experiences is very helpful, not because we can sort of hold on to it or it's a state change, but because it gives us confidence, and we know what we're looking at, and we know what we're looking for, and it stops it feeling like some remote reality. It's like, okay, there's still a lot of things need to be seen and unfold, but it's accessible. So the last thing I wanted to say is was just about, it's the same sort of thing, but really, when we talk about it in the system of practice, it has this title, spiritual death. But we are, in a way, with this sort of dying into, or dying sort of moment by moment to our assumption of what is there, that sort of letting go. And in order to explain this just from a slightly different angle, it's again, just in terms of what's directly happening, and this is it comes from the Nidana chain, but you don't need to know that. But basically what's happening in our experience is that there'll be some form of sense input. Something will come to us through one of the senses. It might be, a sound, a sight, like seeing somebody we like, and but quite often it's a thought, that arises based on that sense input, whatever it is, or you taste something really delicious or whatever. There will be what we term Vedana. There'll be a feeling tone to it. It'll feel either pleasant or unpleasant, or it might feel, you might just zone out because there is no particular feeling tone to it. And then based on that feeling tone, we will have a reaction to that feeling tone where if it's unpleasant feeling tone, we're like, don't want that, pushing that away. Pleasant feeling tone, more, please. Neutral feeling tone, completely zone out. And then based on that reaction, it's like we're coming into being moment by moment. We're then in a certain state, whether it's like, oh, I want more of that, oh, I don't want that, or whatever, or fearing that or whatever. So constantly we're bringing ourselves into being, into a sort of state of being. And if that is quite a solid state of being, it will increase our sense of separation from other people and from the world. And so I just finally wanted to give another sort of more recent, in fact, this week, example from my life, which was that in the world of work outside, I'm going through quite a big transition at work. Well, ultimately transition me out of work. But it's been quite, well, I kept saying to everyone, it's been really bruising. It's been really horrid, but mostly what was happening is that the sense input was a thought, which was something along the lines of, it's not fair, it's not right, it shouldn't be this way, it's not nice. It was a thought that had quite a lot of charge to it, because often it was associated with not feeling trusted, and I know, because I know myself quite well, that, like, for example, honesty and integrity have always been a very core value, even probably, I think, before I was Buddhist. And so if somebody does something which feels like they're not trusting me, or they're not trusting me to be telling the truth or to behave with integrity, it's like that's quite a key button to press, where there's an emotional charge to it, and it's more likely to give that rise to those thoughts of, that's not nice, don't want that, they don't trust me. Anyway, so that's the sense input, is that thought, because I keep remembering it, and then there's an unpleasant Vedana, that sort of unpleasant sensation, and wanting it to go away, but also this coming into being as a state that actually, in this particular case, the state is one of I mean, we use this term in Triratna a lot, but of righteous indignation. I mean, you can probably tell what it means, even if you haven't heard it in this context. It's just like, it's a very puffed up feeling. It's like, don't trust me then, that sense. And I know, because I've seen it directly in the past, that righteous indignation is a really unhelpful, unskillful state. It gives a really solid sense of self and of separation that, cuts out the ability to see other perspectives big time. And I think this was just a couple of days ago, because I was writing this talk and I was quite stuck in this really quite solid sense of righteous indignation, which I knew in the background had to go at some point, because I knew it wasn't really, had to go. But because I was thinking, how can I write a talk on spiritual death and insight from this perspective? I'm really stuck in this quite sticky, heavy, solid reality. So it was the talk that was the trigger, like with the lice, the photos were the trigger for something else, so I just lay on the floor, in a sort of semi-supine position, and just feeling all of the different sensations of solidity and looking at it. And then really quite quickly, because I have done this a lot, it was just like, just let it go, it just all dropped away. And it's just like, this is unhelpful. I don't want to carry these people around, I don't want to be going to bed with my managing director, it's like, in my head, obviously, but, and so there, and so that sort of state did just sort of drop away, and, which has been a great relief. So I was quite grateful for the opportunity, or the pressure, in a way, of having to give this talk, that meant that I needed to engage with something outside of this rather, this sort of righteous, indignant, puffed up state that I was in. So that was, a sense, just to finish, of, where I knew this wasn't helpful. I knew what was happening. I knew what I was doing. I was motivated to do it because I couldn't sit here and give this talk otherwise. And then I was consciously tuning into direct experience, lying down, feeling what was happening, investigating that, which then gave rise to a release. It doesn't, not like it happens every time, but in this sense, and I know that's, I know it'll come back. I have to hold lightly, it's all of this. It's a constant need to keep tuning in, keep looking, keep tuning into direct experience, in order to open to vision as a path of directly seeing reality. Thank you. Thank you. We've got 5 minutes before we need to go. So are there any questions or comments? Yeah, hello.
That sense of self-righteousness, it's also about trying to correct something that you feel is wrong. So can you actually correct the wrong if you're going to dissolve it sort of, and lose that sense of self, which is
yeah. I mean, that is actually a really interesting question to inquire in your direct experience on the basis of, is to look at that and just think, you've got this sense of, this is wrong, I've got to change this. And then if there's a sense of, like, for example, just accepting, okay, this is how it is though at the moment.
Yeah.
You're just dropping into the reality of present moment reality that can take out all or most of that puffed upness, or that energy, if you like. It is energy, isn't it? And then just see, actually, do you just think, nah, it's all right, then I won't bother? Or, my experience is that makes it a more discerning thing. Because actually the thing I'm puffed up about at work, it's not a helpful thing to go in, charging in and fighting in that way.
I see that, yeah.
But there are things that actually do matter, and I do need to communicate, but I need to communicate them not from here, just from a look, come on, folks, actually, this is you know.
So get rid of that egoic kind of.
Yeah, exactly. It's never ever helpful. Yeah, and we don't need it in order to act. No. But it's a good question. But you don't take my word for it. Do investigate it in your own experience, because it's a really interesting thing to look at. Yeah.